Lieutenant Sarah Chen had always been invisible in the briefing room. For 3 years, she had quietly poured coffee, distributed folders, and cleaned up after high-ranking officers without anyone bothering to learn her name. To them, she was just another junior officer performing menial tasks while the real military business happened around her. The morning of October 15th started like any other. Sarah arrived at the Pentagon at 500 hours, 2 hours before the scheduled intelligence briefing. She methodically prepared the conference room, arranging chairs around the massive oak table where decisions affecting national security were made daily. The coffee machine hummed softly as she brewed the dark roast that Admiral Morrison preferred. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Ohio, dreaming of serving her country. Her father had been a Marine, and she had followed in his footsteps, though her path had taken a different direction. While other officers commanded ships or led troops into battle, Sarah found herself assigned to administrative duties at the Pentagon. It wasn't the glorious military career she had envisioned, but she took pride in her work, no matter how mundane others might consider it. As officers began filing into the briefing room, Sarah moved efficiently between them, filling coffee cups and ensuring everyone had the necessary documents. She had perfected the art of being present but unnoticed, a skill that had served her well in these high-level meetings. The conversations around her often dealt with classified information, and she had learned to filter out what she heard, focusing only on her immediate tasks. Admiral Morrison entered the room with his usual commanding presence. A decorated officer with over 30 years of service, he commanded respect from everyone present. His steel-gray hair was perfectly groomed, and his uniform bore the insignia of countless commendations. Sarah had served coffee to the Admiral dozens of times, but he had never acknowledged her existence beyond a brief nod. The briefing began with updates on various military operations around the globe. Sarah continued her quiet work, refilling cups and replacing empty water pitchers. She had heard similar briefings countless times before, each one blending into the next in her memory. The officers discussed troop movements, intelligence reports, and strategic planning with the casual efficiency that came from years of experience. Then something unusual happened. Colonel Martinez, the intelligence officer leading the briefing, mentioned a developing situation in the South China Sea. A Chinese naval vessel had been detected in international waters conducting what appeared to be surveillance operations. The ship's movements were erratic, and satellite imagery showed unusual activity on its deck. Sarah's hand froze mid-pour as she heard the details. The coordinates being discussed were familiar to her, though she couldn't immediately place why. Something about the Chinese vessel's position triggered a memory, but she couldn't quite grasp what it was. She forced herself to continue her tasks, but her mind raced as she tried to recall where she had encountered those coordinates before. The briefing continued with discussions of diplomatic responses and potential military actions. Sarah noticed that several officers seemed concerned about the Chinese vessel's intentions, but no one could definitively explain its presence in that particular area. The ship appeared to be waiting for something, maintaining its position despite radio communications from nearby American vessels. As Sarah moved around the table, she caught fragments of conversation about the vessel's sophisticated equipment and its crew's apparent expertise. The Chinese had been conducting similar operations in the region for months, but this particular incident stood out due to its timing and location. Intelligence analysts were working around the clock to determine the ship's true purpose. Admiral Morrison expressed frustration with the lack of concrete information about the Chinese vessel's mission. The intelligence community had provided detailed reports on the ship's specifications and crew, but they couldn't penetrate the operational security surrounding its current deployment. Without knowing the vessel's intentions, it was difficult to formulate an appropriate response. Sarah's memory suddenly crystallized as she heard Admiral Morrison mention the vessel's communication frequencies. She remembered now where she had seen those coordinates and frequencies before. 3 weeks earlier, while organizing classified documents for filing, she had come across the intelligence report about unusual radio transmissions in that exact area. The report had mentioned intercepted communications suggesting a planned operation, but the details had been fragmentary and difficult to interpret. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The Chinese vessel wasn't conducting random surveillance operations. It was positioned exactly where the intercepted communications had indicated an operation would take place. The ship was waiting for something specific, and Sarah believed she knew what it was. Her heart raced as she considered what to do with this information. As a junior officer performing administrative duties, she had no business interrupting a high-level briefing with her observations. The officers in the room were far more experienced and knowledgeable than she was, and they had access to intelligence reports that she had only glimpsed while filing documents. But the nagging certainty that she possessed crucial information wouldn't leave her alone. She had an excellent memory for details, a trait that had served her well in her administrative role. The coordinates, frequencies, and timing all matched perfectly with the intelligence report she had filed weeks earlier. The Chinese vessel's presence wasn't a coincidence or a random surveillance mission. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she continued serving coffee, trying to appear calm while her mind wrestled with the implications of what she knew. The officers around the table continued their discussion, unaware that someone in the room might hold a key piece of the puzzle they were trying to solve. The weight of her knowledge pressed down on her as she realized that her silence might have serious consequences. If the Chinese vessel was indeed waiting for a planned operation to commence, time could be critical. Every minute of delay in understanding the situation could put American personnel or interests at risk. As the briefing progressed, Sarah found herself in an impossible position. Speaking up would mean revealing that she had access to classified information that wasn't technically part of her duties. It would also mean interrupting a room full of senior officers to share what might amount to nothing more than an educated guess. The potential for embarrassment and disciplinary action was enormous. Yet the alternative seemed worse. If she remained silent and something happened that could have been prevented with the information she possessed, she would never forgive herself. The oath she had taken when joining the military included a commitment to protect and defend the United States, and that commitment didn't come with exceptions for junior officers or administrative personnel. The tension in Sarah's chest grew unbearable as she watched the officers debate various response scenarios to the Chinese vessel. Each passing minute felt like an eternity as she struggled with her decision. The coffee pot grew cold in her hands, but she barely noticed, too consumed by the internal battle between protocol and conscience. Admiral Morrison was explaining the diplomatic complexities of confronting the Chinese vessel when Sarah made her choice. She couldn't remain silent any longer, regardless of the consequences. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward from her position near the coffee station. The movement felt surreal, as if she were watching herself from outside her body. The room seemed to slow as she approached the table where the most powerful military minds in the Pentagon were gathered. Several officers glanced at her curiously, probably wondering why the coffee server was interrupting their meeting. Sarah's mouth felt dry and her voice caught in her throat as she tried to speak. "Excuse me, sir," she managed to say, her words barely above a whisper. The conversation around the table gradually died down as more officers noticed her presence. Admiral Morrison looked up from his notes, his expression showing mild irritation at the interruption. "Lieutenant Chen, isn't it?" the Admiral said, surprising Sarah that he knew her name. "Is there something urgent that requires our attention?" Sarah felt every eye in the room focused on her. The weight of their collective stare was almost overwhelming, but she forced herself to continue. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by the conviction that she was doing the right thing. "Sir, 3 weeks ago I filed an intelligence report that mentioned intercepted communications about a planned operation in those exact coordinates. she said, gesturing toward the map displayed on the wall screen. The frequencies and timing match what we're seeing with the Chinese vessel. The silence that followed her statement was deafening. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears as she waited for someone to respond. She had just confessed to accessing classified information beyond her clearance level, and she had interrupted a high-level briefing to share what might be irrelevant observations. Colonel Martinez was the first to speak, his voice carefully controlled. "Lieutenant, are you certain about those details? The specific coordinates and frequencies?" Sarah nodded, her confidence growing as she realized they were taking her seriously. "Yes, sir. The report mentioned unusual communication patterns suggesting coordinated activity. The Chinese vessel's position matches perfectly with the operational area described in those intercepts." Admiral Morrison leaned forward in his chair, studying Sarah with new interest. His earlier irritation had been replaced by focused attention. "Lieutenant Chen, how do you happen to remember such specific details from a routine filing task?" "I have an excellent memory for patterns and details, sir," Sarah replied. "It served me well in my administrative duties. When I heard the coordinates and frequencies mentioned today, I immediately recognized them from the intelligence report I handled." The Admiral exchanged glances with Colonel Martinez before speaking again. "Colonel, do you recall the report Lieutenant Chen is referencing?" Colonel Martinez was already reaching for his tablet, his fingers flying across the screen as he searched through classified databases. "Sir, I'm accessing the intelligence archives from 3 weeks ago. There were several reports filed during that period." The room remained silent as Colonel Martinez worked, the tension palpable as everyone waited for confirmation of Sarah's claims. She stood at attention, acutely aware that her career hung in the balance. If she was wrong about the details, her interruption would be seen as an embarrassing breach of protocol. "Here it is," Colonel Martinez announced, his voice carrying a note of surprise. "Intelligence Report 2847 Alpha, filed on September 24th. Intercepted communications suggesting planned maritime operation, coordinates match current Chinese vessel position, communication frequencies identical to what we've detected today." Admiral Morrison's expression transformed as the implications became clear. "Colonel, why wasn't this report flagged during our initial analysis of the Chinese vessel?" "Sir, the report was classified at a level that didn't automatically cross-reference with current operational intelligence. It was filed as routine surveillance data rather than actionable intelligence." The Admiral's jaw tightened as he processed this information. "So we have a junior officer performing administrative duties who made a connection that our intelligence analysts missed?" Sarah felt a surge of vindication mixed with apprehension. She had been right about the connection, but she had also exposed serious gaps in the intelligence analysis process. The implications of this oversight extended far beyond her individual situation. "Lieutenant Chen," Admiral Morrison said, his voice taking on a different tone, "tell us everything you remember about that intelligence report. Every detail could be crucial." Sarah took a moment to organize her thoughts before responding. "Sir, the report indicated that intercepted communications mentioned a 3-phase operation. Phase 1 involved positioning assets, Phase 2 involved surveillance and reconnaissance, and Phase 3 was described as implementation, with no further details provided." Colonel Martinez was frantically accessing additional databases as Sarah spoke. "Admiral, if Lieutenant Chen's recollection is accurate, we may be witnessing the transition from Phase 2 to Phase 3 of whatever operation the Chinese have planned." The room erupted into controlled chaos as officers began making phone calls and accessing classified networks. Sarah found herself at the center of rapidly escalating military response protocols, her simple observation having triggered a chain of events beyond anything she had imagined. "Lieutenant," Admiral Morrison called out over the activity, "I need you to work directly with Colonel Martinez to review every detail of that intelligence report." Your memory for specifics may help us identify additional connections we've missed. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and terror as she realized she was being integrated into an active military operation. This was far removed from her usual duties of serving coffee and filing documents. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but she also felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from her military service. Colonel Martinez gestured for her to join him at a secure terminal. "Lieutenant Chen, I need you to walk through everything you remember about that report. The smallest details might be significant." As Sarah began recounting her memories of the intelligence report, she noticed that other officers were treating her differently. The invisible coffee server had suddenly become a valuable intelligence asset. It was a transformation that felt both exciting and overwhelming. "The report mentioned unusual encryption patterns in the intercepted communications," Sarah continued. "The analyst noted that the encryption was more sophisticated than typical Chinese naval communications, suggesting special operations involvement." Admiral Morrison looked up from his phone conversation with a grim expression. "If we're dealing with Chinese special operations, the stakes just escalated significantly. Colonel Martinez, I want a full threat assessment based on Lieutenant Chen's intelligence within the hour." Sarah realized that her decision to speak up had fundamentally changed not only her own situation, but potentially the course of an international incident. The quiet administrative officer who had poured coffee that morning was now providing crucial intelligence for a military response operation. The irony wasn't lost on her that years of being overlooked and underestimated had positioned her to make one of the most significant contributions of her military career. Her attention to detail and excellent memory, traits that had seemed unremarkable in her administrative role, were now proving invaluable in a high-stakes intelligence situation. As the briefing room transformed into an operational command center, Sarah reflected on how quickly circumstances could change. One moment she had been invisible, and the next she was an integral part of a developing military response. The coffee pot still sat where she had left it, a reminder of how dramatically her role had evolved in just a few minutes. Working alongside Colonel Martinez at the secure terminal felt surreal to Sarah. The classified information flowing across the screens represented the kind of intelligence work she had only dreamed about during her early military training. Her administrative background had given her familiarity with the systems, but accessing them as an active participant in an operation was entirely different. "Lieutenant, the encryption patterns you mentioned are crucial," Colonel Martinez explained as they reviewed the archived intelligence report. "Our cryptanalysis team has been working on similar patterns for months without success. Your memory of the specific details might provide the breakthrough we need." Sarah studied the data displayed on the screen, her mind working to recall every nuance of the original report she had filed. The pressure was intense, knowing that military leaders were making critical decisions based on her recollections. She had never imagined that her attention to detail would prove so vital to national security. "Sir, there was something else in the report that seemed odd at the time," Sarah said, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The analyst mentioned that the communication timing followed an unusual pattern, almost like a countdown sequence, but the intervals weren't standard military procedure." Colonel Martinez immediately began pulling up additional analysis tools. "Can you remember the specific timing intervals mentioned in the report?" Sarah closed her eyes, visualizing the document she had handled 3 weeks earlier. Her memory had always been exceptional, a trait that had helped her excel in school and later in her administrative duties. The numbers came to her clearly, as if she were reading the report again. The intervals were decreasing progressively: 72 hours, 48 hours, 24 hours, and then 12 hours, she recited. The analyst noted that if the pattern continued, the final communication would occur at 6-hour intervals leading up to 0 hour. The implications hit Colonel Martinez immediately. "Admiral Morrison needs to hear this right away. If you're correct about the timing pattern, we may be able to predict when their operation will commence. Admiral Morrison approached their workstation as Colonel Martinez called him over. The controlled chaos in the briefing room had evolved into focused operational planning, with officers coordinating responses based on the intelligence Sarah had provided. The transformation from routine briefing to active military operation was remarkable to witness. "What have you discovered, Colonel?" Admiral Morrison asked, his attention focused intently on their analysis. "Sir, Lieutenant Chen has identified a timing pattern in the intercepted communications that could allow us to predict the Chinese operations timeline," Colonel Martinez explained. "Based on her recollection of the intelligence report, we may be looking at a countdown sequence." Admiral Morrison studied the data on their screen before speaking. "Lieutenant Chen, based on your memory of this timing pattern, what would be your assessment of when this operation might commence?" Sarah felt the weight of the question, knowing that her answer could influence military deployment decisions. She carefully calculated the timeline based on the pattern she remembered, cross-referencing it with the current date and time. "Sir, if the original communications began following the pattern 3 weeks ago and the Chinese vessel arrived on station when the 12-hour intervals began, we might be looking at implementation within the next 6 to 12 hours, she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was suggesting. The Admiral's expression became grave as he processed this assessment. "Colonel Martinez, I want immediate coordination with Pacific Fleet Command. If Lieutenant Chen's analysis is correct, we need assets in position within hours, not days." Sarah watched as her observations triggered a cascade of military coordination that spanned multiple commands and thousands of personnel. Ships were being repositioned, aircraft were being prepared for deployment, and intelligence assets were being redirected based on connections she had made while filing routine paperwork weeks earlier. "Lieutenant Chen," Admiral Morrison said, turning to address her directly, "I'm assigning you to work directly with our intelligence analysis team for the duration of this operation. Your detailed memory of the original report may reveal additional connections as events unfold." The assignment represented a complete transformation of Sarah's military career. She was being integrated into the intelligence community based on her demonstrated analytical capabilities, moving far beyond the administrative role that had defined her service. The change was both exciting and intimidating. Over the following hours, Sarah worked closely with experienced intelligence analysts, reviewing intercepted communications and identifying patterns that connected to her original observations. Her unique perspective, combined with her exceptional memory, proved invaluable in piecing together the Chinese operational plan. The Chinese vessel had indeed been following the countdown timeline Sarah had identified. Intelligence intercepts confirmed that the ship was coordinating with other Chinese assets in the region, preparing for what appeared to be a significant maritime operation. The timing pattern she had remembered proved to be the key to understanding their coordination protocol. As the hours passed, American naval forces moved into position based on the intelligence analysis Sarah had initiated. The Chinese operation, when it finally commenced, was met with a coordinated American response that effectively neutralized their objectives. The crisis was resolved without escalation, largely due to the advance warning provided by Sarah's exceptional memory and analytical thinking. Admiral Morrison later called Sarah into his office for a private conversation. The same officer who had barely acknowledged her existence as a coffee server was now recognizing her as a valuable intelligence asset. The conversation would mark the beginning of Sarah's transition from administrative duties to intelligence analysis. "Lieutenant Chen, your actions today demonstrated exceptional service to your country," Admiral Morrison told her. "Your attention to detail and analytical thinking prevented what could have been a significant international incident." Sarah felt a profound sense of fulfillment that had been missing from her previous military assignments. She had finally found a way to serve that utilized her unique capabilities and made a meaningful contribution to national security. The invisible coffee server had become a recognized intelligence professional. The Admiral continued, "I'm recommending you for immediate transfer to the Defense Intelligence Agency. Your demonstrated abilities are exactly what we need in our intelligence analysis division." Sarah's new assignment represented everything she had hoped for when she first joined the military. The years of quiet service in administrative roles had positioned her perfectly for this opportunity, providing her with knowledge of military protocols and classified information systems that would serve her well in intelligence work. Looking back on that morning when she had nervously poured coffee in the briefing room, Sarah realized that her willingness to speak up, despite the risks, had changed not only her own career, but potentially the course of international relations. The moment when Admiral Morrison spoke her call sign and the room went silent had marked the beginning of her transformation from invisible administrative officer to valued intelligence analyst. The coffee pot still sat in the briefing room where she had left it that morning, but Sarah Chen would never again be the invisible person serving coffee to senior officers. She had found her true calling in military intelligence, where her exceptional memory and analytical skills would serve her country in ways she had never imagined possible. Her courage to speak up when it mattered most had transformed her from overlooked support personnel to essential intelligence professional, proving that sometimes the most important contributions come from the most unexpected sources.